guest, Stephen Leigh Morris. Just briefly going to read his biography, and then Stephen will introduce Borisav, Tom, and Natasha. Stephen Leigh Morris is a California-based playwright and arts journalist. His plays have been presented in New York and Los Angeles, with one play, Beechwood Drive, presented off-Broadway and in the London International Theatre Festival as part of a four-city Polish tour. His 2020 dark comedy about the collapse of a newspaper, Red Ink, received an LA Times Critics' Choice citation and run that was extended twice. Enjoy the panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Arbiter. Welcome, and thank you to Chandra Multimedia for hosting this panel, and of course for putting on this festival. So, can theatre critics help the theatre anymore, and can theatre institutions help the reeling sector of arts journalism, and if they can, would they want to? Let's meet our panel. Natasha Tripney from the United Kingdom is the international editor at The Stage, the UK-based theatre industry newspaper. She studied English literature at King's College, University of London, and Warwick University. In 2011, she co-founded Exeunt, an online theatre magazine, which she edited until 2016. She's now the editor of cstage.org, an online platform for theatre criticism in Southeast Europe. As a journalist, she's written about arts and culture for The Guardian and the BBC. She's also contributed to The Independent, the London Evening Standard, Nacht, Critic, and Kosovo 2.0. From Berlin, we have Tom Mustroph, who works in Berlin and Palermo as a freelance journalist. He operates in several journalistic fields, such as theatre, fine arts, and sports. He's most interested in how self-responsible work can succeed elegantly and in accordance to minimal moral standards. He collaborates with several German-language publications, such as TAS, FAS, Neues Deutschland, NZZ, Theater der Zeit Online, Deutschlandfunk, and WDR. Tom wanted to add that he uses his income from sports writing to subsidize his, quote, usually lousy paid writing about theatre and fine arts, unquote. Meanwhile, he says, his arts writing feeds his sports commentary. And once, maybe twice a year, Tom also works as a dramaturg for theatre productions. From Serbia, we have Borisav Matić. He is a critic and dramaturg. He's the regional managing editor at the Theatre Times. He regularly writes about theatre for a range of publications and media. He's a member of the feminist collective Rebel Leaders, with whom he co-edits Bukvika, their platform for literary criticism, and produces literary shows and podcasts. He occasionally works as a dramaturg or a scriptwriter for theatre, TV, radio, and other media. He's also the administrator of IDEA, the International Drama Theatre and Education Association. So welcome and thank you all for being here. Just to frame, if I can just take a few minutes to frame this conversation, among the goals is to avoid too much whining about the state of arts journalism, and perhaps we can explore where we are right now and what we can do to be of the greatest service possible. Just to frame where we're at and where we've come from, let's spin back to August 1955. That was a very long time ago. The Arts Theatre in London was premiering a play by an unknown playwright named Samuel Beckett. The play was a then unknown play called Waiting for Godot. It was directed by Sir Peter Hall, who was not Sir Peter Hall then. He was just Peter Hall and 24 years old. And during a rehearsal, he told the cast, quote, "I haven't really the foggiest idea what some of this means, but if we stop and discuss every line, we'll never open," unquote. The London run was not without incident. The actor who played Pozzo was Peter Bull, and I will quote his recollection of the first few audiences, quote, "Waves of hostility came whirling over the footlights, and the mass exodus which was to form a feature of the run of the piece, started quite soon after the curtain had risen. I heard audible groans, which was also fairly disconcerting. The curtain fell to mild applause, and we took a scant 3 curtain calls. His scene partner, Peter Woodthorpe, reports only 1 curtain call. And a depression and a sense of anti-climax descended on us all. Everything changed 4 days later. On August the 7th, 1955, when 2 reviews appeared, one by Kenneth Tynan and one by Harold Hobson, respectively writing for The Observer and for the Sunday Times, and they essentially said this was the most important play in half a century, and they turned a play that was destined for oblivion into an historical monument. And even Beckett, who uses, within that play, if you may recall, there's a series where the 2 clowns, they have an insult match, and they're trying to see who can insult the other character the most. And the final punch, the knockout punch, is when one of them turns to the other and calls him a critic. And even so, Beckett was always grateful to Harold Hobson and to Kenneth Tynan for rescuing his play and perhaps his reputation. A few years later, 1958, the birthday party went through a very similar thing, although it opened in Cambridge and did quite well. When it premiered for a commercial London run, it lasted 9 days, after which Harold Hobson again wrote a review. The play had collapsed to critical disclaim, shall we say, and Harold Hobson rescued the play's reputation with a rave review, and the play went on to become a modern classic, and it was one of Pinter's first plays, so probably rescued Harold Pinter as well. That is the consequence of having drama critics who have a platform and have influence. The question is, what has happened since then? By the way, I'm not trying to romanticize this history. It's paradoxical, because with that power and with that influence and with that platform comes a huge potential for abuse. And that was often a complaint about drama critics that's been codified in countless jokes and derision. There was a dance critic in San Francisco, for instance, this is an example, has a huge platform, and he attacked an actress in a ballet, a dancer in a ballet, and with a very rude, it was personal, and it was rude, and he commented about how she'd eaten too many potatoes before the dance, or something to that effect. And the problem was, she wasn't in the performance he attended. The only reason they discovered that she had been switched out, she had the flu that night, and somebody else had stepped in. So he reviewed the wrong actress, and the reason he reviewed the wrong actress is because he wasn't there. He hadn't actually attended that performance. So he reviewed a show, which I suppose that's nice work if you can get it, isn't it? To write reviews of productions you've never seen. He had actually seen her in an earlier performance, and that was what he was reviewing. Anyway, he was fired immediately, but that's par for the course of the kinds of abuse that this kind of power carries with it, and also the kind of responsibility. I have other examples, but I'll move on. So what has happened? When Tynan and Hobson were writing, they were writing in print media. This is commerce, and newspapers supported themselves by a metric called circulation, which is very different from what's happening today. Circulation simply meant how many subscribers do we have, and how many newspapers are distributed on the streets and collected when those newspapers are replaced. And they measured that, and that is the foundation for advertising revenue which supports the newspaper. That was the financial model. There was no way of distinguishing how a sports section was doing, contrasted against, say, an art section, which brings us back to Thomas. What Thomas is doing individually and personally is he's subsidizing the arts through his sports writing, and what he's doing individually in those years was done institutionally. But when things went digital, the measurement and the metrics changed, and they could actually identify who was reading which sections of a newspaper, and that really changed the dynamics. And lo and behold, they discovered very quickly that people reading sports, the numbers of people reading sports was far, far greater than the people who, in the public who were reading the art sections. And this led to what has now become a legendary decline of arts criticism, simply because of those financial metrics. The final aspect is this is not just digital media, it's social media. When I was the editor at the LA Weekly, and we discovered very quickly as soon as the paper went online that people were not actually visiting the site of the newspaper. They were discovering writing through social media, through Facebook, Twitter, and now TikTok and Telegram, and what have you. That is a different kind of distribution of information that's decentralized. With this, and the rise of my theory is that it's fueled by social media, but there has been a rise in populism because everybody can have a platform now, which is paradoxical. It's not entirely a good thing, and it's not entirely a bad thing. But it has consequences because with that, populism appears to have been the erosion of any kind of confidence in expertise. And coming from the United States, this is just pervasive. Nobody believes anybody. And when you have, for instance, the public health expert of the United States, Dr. Fauci, who's ridiculed as a fool and an idiot because he's telling people to wear masks during COVID, we've got a national problem about the dissemination of information. Criticism, theater criticism and theater writing is predicated on expertise, on the ability of a journalist to have an insight that other people might not have. So the reader can say, oh, I never quite saw it that way. That's the goal. And that's where we are in 2022, pressing as strenuously into 2023. I have 5 questions for this entire panel, and now I'd like to sort of ask each of you, and they're related, but I'll go one question at a time, and we can start down the line, if you would. First, before we get to how we can be of service, what are your loftiest ambitions for your role as a journalist critic? And this can be writing theater reviews, this can be interviews, this can be essays. Natasha, do you want to go?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think, and one that I want to answer in 2 parts, because I'm coming from the UK, which has it's quite a commercial theatre scene. We do have government subsidy, but ultimately it falls down to, like, it is commercial. It's to do with sales of tickets to the work that is succeeding and having space to have a platform. So from my, which means that to see this work, to access this work, it costs money for the audience. And I think that one of the multiple roles that the critic can perform is one of access to art. The art that should be and is for everyone, that being able to read about a work that for financial, geographic or other factors you're not ever going to be able to see, it enables an audience, a readership to engage with the art that's being made. That certainly before online streaming of performances became readily available, it was often the only way to engage with work that was, as a student, certainly, I couldn't afford to see a lot of the work that I was interested in, but I could read about it, and a lot of my theatre education was through reading criticism. I learned about Pinter, I learned about Beckett through reading the writings of critics, so I think it is a tool of access, particularly when in a commercially driven theatre sector like we have in the UK. And it is also has a double purpose for me, which is of championing and discovery of artists who are operating outside of the mainstream, on the margins, who are making work that is resisting sort of dominant narratives in the UK's sort of political system. It's like introducing them to a readership where otherwise they may not have the space. You might not learn about these artists. It's the role of the critic to be a kind of sort of detective, as it were, like finding, or maybe that's not the right word, but to discover and to explain the work of artists who are challenging the system, who are finding different modes of working, and it's introducing them to a wider readership. I think that is also, should be and can be the role of the critic to do this. When there is limited space in mainstream publications, there is a tendency to focus on the known and the familiar and the larger famous names, so a critic can resist that model and can bring younger emerging artists to the front and different models of working and work that challenges the mainstream. So I think that is a fundamental role of a critic. And something we can possibly discuss a little later is like while this old model of the Hobson and the Tynan does not exist anymore, this means, or does not certainly exist in the same way that it did, which means that you lose this this figure of the manipulative, like omnipotent critic in like All About Eve, this, who can use their power in very malign ways, and you end up with a system where you have a much more diversity of voice, polyphony of voice of people from different backgrounds, different sexualities, different abilities of, and different experiences of life, and this makes criticism much richer and more varied, but also it's very hard to sustain this model, so this is something I think we'll continue to talk about today. But I think there are like positives and negatives to this moving, the shifting away from the critics of the Tynans and the Hosbans towards something new and more varied and richer, and having a variety of voice. It can be nothing but positive. It's just how you sustain that, how that becomes, how you can keep those voices and nurture them and give them space, and that's something I think which is a very active discussion at the moment, certainly in UK criticism.
Yeah, I also have a more-fold answer of a simple question. It's also a bit time-bound, because when I started this criticism, still in university, the ambitions were very, very high, and I imagined myself on the same level as the most famous directors and actors, to make a dialogue with them and even be on a level above, to be a kind of coach and tell them where the flaws and the errors were, because I had the knowledge of science on my side. Quite quickly I realized that I wouldn't endure this that very long, and also I reminded myself that to criticism belong more actors, more elements, so that it's also good to write for an audience, to write for spectators, to criticize still the professionals and to be in a dialogue with them, but to forget a bit the notion to have the wisdom and the power and just to settle down a bit. Then there came a second phase where I was much interested in accompanying emerging artists, because I was curious, it was new, and also in German criticism, it was in a kind of aristocratic area. There were the old guys who were sitting at the newspapers, and they wrote the reviews for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, maybe 100 years, the same people. And there was no place for younger ones, or there was a place when you belong to the court of them, and I was too anarchistic to go to a court of an older critic, and so it was a kind of alliance between emerging artists who had the same problem in their field, because all the spots were filled with the older, well-known artists, and they were rebelling, and I was rebelling, so we were rebelling on both sides, and that was quite a while interesting. For me, then it was not only to feature those artists, but also to engage in dialogue with the audience, and also with financial systems, and how to broaden the basis of the independent scene. But soon I also realized that I'm not a critic anymore, but I became a kind of promoter of them, and I was also too much engaged in that, and then I had to distance myself from it, because when you are too much in it, when you are too much compatriot of the scene itself, yeah, your view is contaminated and maybe less valuable. And now I have a more realistic, pragmatic approach, and that is, it regards the publications, the media I write for. Some are more consumer orientated, and they put the focus more for the benefits of the audience. Some are more academic, and there I can return to my first ambitions a bit without the errors of then. And others are more general interest, where I can balance all the aspects.
So, very soon after I started doing theatre criticism, I actually started to question whether that makes any sense. And that's of course connected to whether theatre makes any sense, because of course it has much less influence than it used before. But in the meantime, I realized that we don't have to start some big revolutionary changes in theatre or in criticism, that we can be involved in some smaller changes in many other ways. And I think what we are often forgetting is that the stories that we tell about ourselves, that we tell in theatre, actually in the long term influence who we actually are and how society functions. And recently I've been doing some research, a bit of a historical topic, theatre history from recent actually, how theatre actually played a very big role in social changes, also negative social changes here in this region from the 80s till today. Because when in Yugoslavia, when the economic crisis started in the 80s, because of many complex reasons, we don't have time to get into that now, but when that started, people started also losing faith in that system, also not just in the system, but about in the unity and solidarity that existed to some extent, and they tried to fix those things with some strikes, with some protests, but that didn't happen. And actually what happened in that situation, when people lost that narrative that was driving the whole country, the theatre, not just theatre, but also literature stepped in with their interpretations of history and society, and those were the ones that actually brought nationalism into the discourse. So we have some greatest works, I mean, in the not the qualitative sense, but in the production sense in the 80s, that actually changed the course of how people think about our society. So we have some historical plays, historical dramas that actually had an idea behind it, primarily in Serbia, I'm talking there, that people can trust no one, that they can trust only their own nation. In Serbia, that was the Serbian nation, that everyone else who exists in the region betrayed the Serbian people at some point. And of course, because that was a historical topic, usually historical topics in those plays, usually First or Second World War, but it also correlated on how people saw their present society. Of course, it started first in Serbia, and then other countries in the region started using that same narrative, but it's very important where it started. Yes, so I think what we can learn from this is when society, when a value system collapses, it's usually arts or some other narrative forms that actually can bring in the new narrative. And okay, is it the microphone? And I think what's also important to mention is that theatre critics of the time in Serbia in the 80s
The music is really quite beautiful.
Okay, we can try. We can stop if need be. Yes. So some of the most important, most influential theatre critics of the time in Serbia in the 80s actually endorsed these theatre shows that were known for their quite nationalistic agenda, and 40 years later we are still stuck in that narrative. And either we want to say it or no, but theatre and criticism can also play a very negative role in our society. And another example perhaps is the fairy tales in literature and theatre also, and how they shape actually how we think about ourselves. And of course we can talk about how we see women characters in fairy tales, and how those kind of narratives taught us that the role of the women is to find a husband, to be loyal to him even when he harasses her, to see other women as competition, etc., etc. And if feminist criticism didn't step in and played a very important role in revising how we see these narratives, I think also that lives of many girls and now women and all of us actually would be very different. So what I want to say is that the theatre critics, at least today, don't play such a grand role like maybe they did in the 50s when they could decide the fate of Beckett's play or someone else's play, but we are in this discussion. I think for me it's very important how theatre criticism interprets art and how interprets the society in large. And if we don't have the influence that critics once had, and we don't, that still doesn't mean that we can give up, but we can be part of that discussion every day with our every review, with every text that we write, and actually be in a dialogue that's ever present.
Thank you. Let's roll back the other way with a follow-up question, which is, you've expressed to some degree what your ambitions are, and some of them are in their areas where your responses are overlapping, and their responses the areas where they're not. But starting with you, Borisav, because you really talked about the sort of a history of the role of arts critics and its connection to the politics of a particular country. The follow-up question, in terms of your ambitions in your participation as an arts journalist, how do you feel that your ambitions have been or can be met? And if not, what are the impediments? And this is where we risk slipping into the whinging phase, but we'll try to keep that in check.
Yes, well, there are many obstacles, and I think one of the reasons is that transition to a digital society, and because I think things are much more fragmentary now than they were before. Because before we have some leading newspapers, leading TV stations, radio stations that were doing theatre criticism, and people didn't have much choice. They could either listen or read them or not. But today we have a wide range of everything: internet portals, radio stations. As you said, Stephen, almost everyone can start that, at least in some very basic form. Yes, at least start, if nothing else. And I think that we receive much more information than we can actually process. That's not only theatre criticism, but generally in our society. And we're constantly bombarded by information from social media, from media, and then think sometimes it's too much, that we cannot handle all of that. And of course, it's completely understandable that people don't know where to look exactly, and who to trust. So those are all the obstacles, but I think still that people who are really interested in theater, that they can find some publications that they can trust, and if it's something that critics are really doing, are really devoted to it, are really do it all the time, and in the long term gain some, gain trust, I think that we can actually hope to be part of that dialogue and to people to be interested in hearing what we say.
Thank you. Just to personalize that with a very quick follow-up, do you feel you have been able to accomplish what you've stated as some really fine ambitions? Any of them, even partly?
Yes, I'm grateful that I'm part of the discussion, that I have my interpretations of theater and also some larger issues that people are following that we don't agree all the time, but we have a dialogue about that. Sometimes even people from theater, for example, change how they worked a little bit because of something that I've written or my colleagues written. So yes, against all these obstacles, I'm grateful that I'm part of the discussion.
Thank you. Tom?
The question was about the obstacles.
The question was, to what degree do you feel you've accomplished some of your goals? You also talked about how you had extremely lofty ambitions and you stepped back, and then you became an advocate, and then you needed to step back from that. So how do you feel now about what you've been able to accomplish and can continue to accomplish in this field?
Yeah, I mean, of the more meager ambitions, some of them I can accomplish, yeah. Let's say the dialogue, what I do in the more consumer-orientated publications, there I get the feedback of the theater principals, the theater makers. Sometimes, Tom, after your article appeared, we have much more people coming, so thank you for that. They don't call me when after an article of mine the people don't come, but at least that's the kind of feedback. So
nobody's coming, but you gave us great insight, so thank you for that. Yeah, you don't get that kind of praise.
And on the second field, let's say, with a kind of discussion in the field, of course, that is going on, but I also noticed a tendency with theater makers that they are much more concentrated on their own work. They don't see so much work of the others, and they receive a critique only in the criteria of do you praise me or do you criticize me, and so it's becoming much more egocentric, and that takes away a lot of joy, because it's not a good point for a conversation. And what is also a bit deteriorating the field is that, and now I'm coming into the whining path of our discussion, is that space for publications is reduced, not dramatically, but from year to year it's more reduced. And that means that also we critics lose possibilities to see, lose possibilities to write, and there is a certain decline of competence, because you can't only fuel yourself from your experience of the past, you have also to go to performances and to write about performances, but when there's no space to publish it, then you also don't go there, and that means that you miss a lot and that you lose competence, and that certainly is according supporting for other colleagues in Berlin, and at the moment there's no solution.
I'd like to just to rewind a little bit to provide a little bit more context as I answer this question. So I'd say around about 15 or so years ago, with the sort of decline of space in some of the mainstream outlets, there was also a real sort of growth of independent blogs online, which were having really vibrant and exciting, like long-form discussions about productions, and often coming to very different conclusions and opening up discussions that weren't happening in mainstream spaces at all. One particular example I will just cite is a production of a play by Simon Stevens called Three Kingdoms, which was opened, I think, in 2006, maybe a little later than that, maybe like 2009, and it received like fairly sort of mediocre reviews. It was sort of there was a little bit of praise, but it was largely dismissed. But in this online in theatre blogs, there was a huge amount of excitement and discussion and dialogue about this performance, which was a lot of younger critics found exciting. It brought sort of aspects of European theatre making onto the stage in ways that certainly a younger generation hadn't experienced before, and there was a really sort of vibrant discussion from this production that was not existing in any mainstream spaces at the time. And I think for a period of years there was a really exciting theatre blogging sort of space where discussions we're having about representation, about the kind of voices that we're seeing on stage, about different models of working that would not have happened if it was happening in mainstream spaces. There just wasn't room or sort of will for that kind of discussion, and yet there clearly was a desire for this to happen because it was taking place. And I'm not going to like wholly praise it because it was still relatively exclusionary and still like a predominantly male space, but it was definitely a more exciting intellectual space than you were finding in a lot of outlets, just because there was room, for one thing. Most papers who were publishing was cutting away the amount of space and time that they had for arts journalism, and online this was expanding. And in 2011, myself and some other writers created this online platform, Exeunt, which was like to house a lot of these discussions that were already happening in the blogosphere, and to give them like a space for this ongoing dialogue, for bringing voices together and engaging often in critical dialogues rather than having just one critic writing one text. There would be multiple voices and multiple opinions and lots of conversation, and there was a really exciting time for criticism. There was lots of new voices emerged through this process, lots of voices found like a space and a platform to publish their work, and so this is a moment where I feel something was achieved, and I'm very proud to have been a part of creating that, with the caveat that as a sustainable model, it struggled to sustain itself. We were never able to find long-term funding for this project, only short project-by-project funding, and being a freelance arts journalist, being an arts journalist is a precarious profession, and 2 years ago we had the pandemic, and just as artists were, obviously everyone was negatively affected, but like if you were an artist, you know, you're particularly feeling the precarious nature of your existence. The same thing happened with arts journalism, so a lot of people who were finding ways of like working here, working there a little bit, just that stopped being a viable way of working. And I feel that exciting online theatre community that I was talking about has largely moved on to, like in the UK, Twitter is probably the biggest social media tool that people use to communicate, and I feel that has sort of had a detrimental effect on those conversations. There are less spaces. The people who are blogging are now having arguments on Twitter, which is a form of dialogue, but it's a different form, and the space for long-form criticism has again dwindled a little bit because of financial aspects of sustainability, of people's need to have employment and find ways of sustaining themselves, and that's not criticism for a lot of people. So voices have drifted into other directions. Some have gone into dramaturgy, some have left and stopped writing. So we're in a not a wholly positive place at the moment. I'm not quite sure what the solution is to that or what will happen next, but there was a moment where there was something quite exciting happening, but that was already a moment in the past, I think.
Let's go back. Resuming with you, Natasha, depending on the platform, because you have a couple of platforms. You have the stage, where you're an editor, and then you have C-stage, which are serve very different purposes. When you're writing, and this is a question for everybody, and then this will tie into whether or not we can team up with theatre institutions. Who do you imagine that you're writing for? Are you writing for yourself? Are you writing for theatre makers? Are you writing for a general public that has a fleeting interest in theatre? And these may overlap, so just prioritize. Because all of the above may be true, but when you're typing or writing, who do you imagine hearing this conversation?
I think, again, it depends on the platform that I'm writing for. The stage is a newspaper predominantly for the people who work in the theatre industry, so I'm not very aware when I'm writing texts for the stage that the people who are reading it either work in theatre or they have enough interest in theatre to be reading this publication, which is aimed at an audience of theatre makers and people who are involved in some way in this the making of theatre or in the running of theatres as cultural spaces. In other publications, I think with Exeunt, it was always for a more general readership. I think there's a self-selecting part of that readership that will be involved in theatre in some way, but it was always meant to be a more open space, a more space that brought in readers from with different cultural interests and hopefully appeal to them in a way, because the writing was hopefully lively and maybe slightly irreverent and wasn't afraid to be playful, and I hope that made it for an interesting reading experience for people, not just people who are making theatre themselves, but also people just who are casual theatre goers perhaps, or just want to read about one particular performance that they have an interest in. So I would definitely adjust my mode of writing depending on which of those platforms that I was writing for. I think there's always an awareness in your mind that the theatre maker may read or engage with your criticism, but that's never my that's never my primary thinking when I'm writing. I'm writing for an imagined reader who likes theatre and is passionate about theatre, but may not necessarily make it themselves. But with the stage, there is that caveat that it is aimed at an industry audience, so I will tailor my writing to that and provide more about background about the production or the venue or some context that I think may not be interesting to a general readership but will be interesting to a specific industry readership.
Thank you. Tom?
In general, writing for me is a very egoistic process. I write for myself, or I write because I'm interested in things and I try to elaborate it, and I don't think about audience or people to address. I mean, a bit later comes in for whom, for which media I write, and then it's more consumer oriented, more academic, more I don't know. But the process of writing is just was there something interesting I've seen what is worth to elaborate further, or when there was nothing really interesting but I have to write a text, then I put some brain into finding at least an interesting point, and then it goes. The only difference is when I do radio, not when I write the manuscript, but when speaking it in the studio, then I have to imagine a person to address it, because then the voice becomes more vivid. But that's the one. It's more a technical thing.
Thank you.
Well, my educational background is dramaturgy, and when I was studying dramaturgy, I started doing theatre criticism, because there's no department for theatre criticism in Serbia. So because of that background, somehow I started writing in criticism, thinking of the people who created that piece of that art piece, that theatre work. I was thinking about the director, about the writer, about the actors, and of course all technicians and all the other people who were involved, and I was thinking how to explain something in a very how do I say, how to explain what they're doing and how do I examine that by using the expertise of their field also, to be in dialogue with them, and also when I come to that evaluation part, for me to be very clear when I'm speaking to them. But then later I also stepped into literary criticism, and then what one colleague said, no, I'm not writing for the authors, because then I would be writing just for one person, my review. Why don't I send him or her just a note, just an email, and with my comments? And then I realized that this is much. Of course, I can also be writing for the artists and the people involved in theater, but also to the wider audience. And then I came to this, which I mentioned before today. The question of interpretation and being in a dialogue about theatre, in a dialogue not just with theatre professionals but also with the wider audience. And I think that's primarily to whom I'm writing now, the audience and also the potential audience. If someone hasn't seen theatre in a long time, but they stumble upon an article and maybe they get interested. But when I'm writing, for example, about acting, I also try to be very precise and to also be at least constructive about the actor, and generally to be that's my a secondary focus now. That I also be constructive for when I'm speaking about the artist's work. And as Natasha and Tom mentioned, also it depends on the publication, on the media. If it's a theatre journal, then of course it's a more academic tone, or if not academic, a little bit more how do I say, internal. And it's different if I'm writing for a portal. Then I really try to be as open as possible and to explain everything that's everything that's not so well known, that some kind of internal theatre things. I don't shy of mentioning them, but I also want to be very clear in explaining them.
Thank you. Let's play a game, and then we could. This can be interactive. This last question can lead to audience questions for any of us about anything. But imagine that we've got two sectors that are struggling. We have the theatre-making sector, which is obviously, with a possible exception of Germany, is in about as bad a shape as it's ever been. Although Tom was quick to point out, as comparatively well subsidized as the German theatre is, the art journalism sees absolutely none of that help. Can we pull? Is it possible? Can we imagine a way in which we can pull each other up, the creative people and the critical people, in a symbiotic way, which doesn't compromise the ability of journalists, whether they're critics or essayists or interviewers, to compromise their ability to tell the truth, which really lies at the heart of the integrity of the field. Is that possible, or is that a fool's errand? And then we can open that up, because some of you are theatre makers and producers in the audience, and I'd be curious to see if you can also imagine such a symbiosis, or whether it would be dismissed as corrupt.
I have an example I can discuss. This is something I think that's up for discussion, but it's quite a good example to illustrate some of the things that you just described, Stephen. So there's a company called Middlechild, who are a UK company who are based in Hull, which is a town in the north of England, which had relatively sort of impoverished by UK standards, and was in 2017 I think was like a UK city of culture, and there were some attempts made to re-energize the cultural sector there. And this one company, Matić, they have now got Arts Council funding, which is the body that funds arts organisations in the UK. They have some money from the Arts Council, and they used part of their funding to create a scheme for nurturing and supporting critics, which is quite an unusual step for an arts organisation to take, to funnel some of that money to creating workshops and an online platform for critical voices in Hull, in the town where they're based, on the basis that there was not really much local journalism left. It had been eroded over time, as so much local journalism has, and there wasn't really a space for cultural conversations and critical discussions. So they thought, as an arts organisation, they benefit from there being a healthy critical culture, and they used some of the money from their funding to try and regenerate sort of a critical space in Hull, like supporting bloggers and people with an interest in sort of developing their journalistic skills. And part of that was that they would, as Hull is one of the biggest, or one of the most significant theatre companies in Matić are one of the most significant theatre companies in Hull, that a lot of that would be, these critics would come and review their work and talk about their work, and they were finding a way of making sure that that was, an impartiality was there, despite the fact they were supplying the funding. They were also supplying the funding for their own work to be criticised by these critics. They seem to, from what I understand, speaking to the company director, think there was a lot of success in this. They developed some critical voices in the town that they're based, and that led to a larger, sort of more engaged critical culture and podcasts and online discussions. But I'm interested in, as artists, their choice to do that. And
that is interesting.
Yeah, it's a good model to discuss, I think. It's the most closest to what you were describing that I can think of.
Do you think, this is so much a matter of perception, but the critics who were writing up in Hull, did they feel some pressure to be careful, more careful with their words than they would otherwise be because of the funding source?
I'm not sure. I think that clearly was a discussion that was going on. It's a relatively small town, so there are two other maybe big theatres, and everyone engaged in theatre and criticism, inevitably there was some overlap. People knew one another, so it's finding ways in small environments where there is, people are familiar with the work and the artists, and I think that's a line that every critic has to kind of work out for themselves, but they certainly managed to create more critical discussion in a town or a space where there wasn't a lot of that going on. So, but I need to do more investigation and speak to more people, but it's certainly a model that I found interesting, and it's seemed to have some success, definitely, in creating space for discussion with the initial impetus, the funding coming from the artists themselves.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would have a follow-up question to Natasha. Do you know if in that model and how what you presented, was there more readers gained for the theatre discourse than there have been before?
I believe so. One of the reasons they set it up is that there wasn't much going on before. Those spaces didn't really exist. So in creating them, they created, I think, an appetite for them, and there certainly seemed to be engagement with that work. So yes, I think, and I don't have access to the statistics, but certainly there was very little there before, and there was something afterwards. So something changed, something shifted, and for the positive, I think.
That's a good notice, because what I see, at least in Germany, is that there's also the tendency that arts organizations create own critical devices, let's say it like that. And for writers it's also interesting, because you continue in the field, you get some money, you are in the field, in the discourse, but I doubt that, at least from the publications I know a bit, that they reach beyond the circle of that special theater, that arts organization, that arts federation, that institution. So it's the people who don't read reviews anymore in the newspapers, because they are not anymore in the newspapers, don't buy those other new publications, and that's quite a big problem, because to regain audience, you should attract those people who have not the possibilities in the daily papers, because the place there diminishes, and so it's a distribution question, and the distribution problem, in my view, is not solved with publications linked to arts institutions and arts organizations. It may help to establish and refine the discourse. It may help to create excellency on all sides, and also it's necessary, but there's a risk that the audience is not increased by it, and that the discussions are only discussions in very small circles. And there's also a bit the problem of the independence of critics who work for arts organizations or for their publications, and that's quite critical, but just sitting here, I went a bit back in history in my mind, and I think that was always a problem, because also the critics in the 1920s in Roaring Berlin were linked to the theater makers. They were sometimes friends of them, sometimes one investor gave the money to the theater principal, to the dramatist, and to the critic. They were in the same coffee shops, they had the same friends, sometimes they made love with the same people. So it was always linked and connected, and there was always the risk of contamination, and I think the only criteria to remain at least intellectual independent is that you remain intellectual independent. So it's a question of the moral of the individual. And the bad thing is that it's not provable. So unless we want to establish a new kind of inquisition who looks if the minds of the people are really independent, but you can only trust, or you can develop trust by reading.
I guess, well, I think that those collaborations between arts organizations and critics can really help us. I think that we need to have some boundaries, but I think that they can really help us. I think that mainstream media is less and less interested in criticism, and of course we have less and less space there. For example, in Kosovo, I know that someone mentioned last year on the panel here, Kosovo doesn't have a printed newspaper, for example, only TV and electronic and other media. So, Stephen, you talked about the rise of populism and like kind of a decline in the space in mainstream media, but those things already started here. I mean, in the region in the 80s, and now, of course, Kosovo, as Haris Pašić last year on this panel said, Kosovo is actually an avant-garde because they don't have a newspaper, a printed newspaper. So I guess that the West should look to the Balkans as their future, like it or not. But I think in this atmosphere where mainstream media is less and less interested in criticism, that we need to find also other collaborations. And I think that one very good example of a successful collaboration is actually right in front of us, and that's C-Stage. I mean, Natasha or someone from Chandra Multimedia, correct me, but C-Stage, this portal for regional theatre criticism, was actually founded by Chandra Multimedia. And in a way, arts organizations can help arts critics who are disadvantaged. But
And it has German funding, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
But I also think it's very important, it might, in a hypothetical situation, it might be a conflict of interest if someone from the theater company was the editor of the portal, but now, of course, Natasha is the editor, and I think that's very important, and she can call some independent critics to write about Chandra's performances, not to be someone who's involved with the Chandra team. And also another example is the Maska, non-profit organization from Slovenia. They run one of the oldest theater journals in Europe, Maska, but they're also a production company. They collaborate with other theaters on theater productions, and they also started recently, a few years ago, the portal Neodvisni, which means independent, a portal dedicated for theater criticism on the independent cultural scene, because before that there was no criticism in Slovenia about the independent scene, and I think also that's a very good example, and until now I don't see any conflict of interest, because they don't write themselves about the program, they don't write reviews, but they do engage other critics who are more independent in that sense.
The traditional model for this kind of support in the print media, even on some online, was called advertising, where they can pay to put a poster of their show on the platform, and that can contribute, and yet in newspapers that was never considered a conflict of interest, although an editor might shift a review in the direction of an advertiser, but without knowing how that review was going to come out. So that's another possible model. I'd like to open this up here to any questions you have on any of the things we've discussed to close out this panel. Yes?
Yes, my name is Vanga Kostova. Thank you. My name is Ivanka Apostolova. I'm coming from Skopje, from Macedonian Center of International Theatre Institute Produkcija. I have a small digression. I would like to ask you, as a theatre critics and art journalists, what do you think about these new tests and tendencies creating theatre with the tools of virtual reality and augmented reality? Something that arises between after COVID situation and in front of testing our near or far future connected with transhumanism. For example, when I am a recipient of theater or any other contemporary art interventions connected with virtual reality, and when I put the glasses, I'm talking now like I have migraine, for example. I'm not cynical, I'm just reflecting my reactions coming from my head, from my body.
Yeah.
So I find it as an experiment interesting, but what is the perspective? What is the point with virtual theater without live action, for example? What is your opinion? I'm sorry, I receive a lot of information from Germany via Goethe Institute, what is happening there in this field. I find it interesting, but I also mentioned these limitations and question marks connected with the perspective of this kind of approach in the domain of theater and the tools of artificial creativity. Thank you.
Yeah, during pandemic there was a lot of things produced in Germany, and some interesting stuff, a lot of not that interesting stuff, and for me there were several groups of productions, let's say, and I had also my problems with some VR productions, because when you are alone in those spaces, you just walk around and it's nice, but it has more an installation character, and one very important element of theater, meeting other people before and after the show, and also see them as spectators during the show, was absent, and that was really a problem. Then theater makers worked on that. They created foyers before and after so that you could meet, and so that a live moment also reappeared in the digital. But what I really found interesting were some works of people when audience could meet virtually and virtually with your virtual bodies attend a performance and interact with the others. So I guess that's one line what has future. The other line of working is everything with augmented reality. So when you enhance the room, you can do things in the city space. You can also do things in indoor rooms and enrich reality with new narrations or with extensions of the room you have. And there were a lot of interesting things. Some not that interesting, but I guess that has also a future. And then the problem is only if there will be money allocated to work with it, or was it only a kind of a pandemia bubble where artists used it because they couldn't perform otherwise. And that we will see in the future, but I think some people who worked in that field before now have the production money to go beyond, and that's a good thing. And some other people who joined during pandemia developed expertise, and that might be interesting, but I don't think that analog theater will be dead because of that. But it's an interesting field. And then, of course, there's a problem that some people do not, or have problems with the technology, like the migrainer you mentioned. You are not alone. And so that's a kind of barrier and exclusion. And here I don't know how good technology will evolve to solve that problem. If it remains a really physiological problem, then we have a problem.
I think what you said about the point, like access, I think there is also the converse of that like some virtual and reality performances could allow access to performances to people who, like certainly in the UK, like a lot of our historic theatres are not buildings that are accessible to a large number of people because they are old buildings, they are not easily adapted. So if you have mobility issues or other sort of difficulties accessing that space, virtual reality or any form of sort of digital performance is suddenly opening up performance to people who would have difficulties accessing it otherwise. Also, there's the geographic factor as well. It enables you to engage with the performance across the country in different times. Sometimes, like the people who have the kind of jobs that do not allow them to go to a performance at 7 o'clock in the evening can watch a performance at 3 a.m. if they watch one, two, or like in the afternoon of like a Monday. So there are definite positives, I think, to digital work, and innovations with virtual reality work. I saw a fascinating performance from the Donmar Warehouse, which is a company in London which created a virtual Donmar Warehouse which you could access through a virtual reality headset, and you could sit on the theatre and be populated with a virtual audience to make a piece that was about COVID and isolation, so that the paradox of the virtual audience was central to this particular piece. It wouldn't always work for other performances, but in this one it was very very like eerie and unsettling in an interesting way. But I think, as you said, analog performances before, it's a live medium, and all of these innovations have benefits and drawbacks. But like I have an electronic book and a Kindle in my bag, but that does not mean I don't buy paper books, and like will continue to do so. Like one does not eclipse or sort of to the detriment of the other medium. They can coexist and augment and enhance each other. And I think that's the more positive way of looking at it. It's not a threat. It can be very exciting, and it will perhaps only enhance and improve people's ability to engage with live performance.
Yes, I think there's no question that, for example, these recordings that we saw during the pandemic of theater are not theater by definition, but recordings of theater, but that doesn't mean that they don't have an important role of diffusing theater and making it more accessible. And I agree with Natasha completely. Some people watch those recordings because they don't have the means or the time to go to theater, that doesn't mean that people who want the actual contact and interaction won't come to theater. But I think that's not the question if it's theater or not. That's not so much complex, but I think when we really enter the realm of interactive online performances, let's call it performances if not theater, that's a question what that is. For example, Erika Fischer-Lichte, the German theater scholar, says that theater is where the autopoietic feedback loop happens. That means that there's constant interaction between the audience and the performers, and when the audience reacts to something that the performers do, then the performers feel that, and then they react to that. For example, if someone is playing a comedy, you can imagine that it's a completely different performance if the audience is laughing all the time or not at all, for example. But if we have some online performances like we had during the pandemic, where people could actually chat or actually exchange videos on Discord or some other online platforms, and when you have this feedback loop, so is that theater or not? But I think we also need to examine what theater is even more broadly. So, okay, this is the online space, and if those interactive performances in the online space have this autopoietic feedback loop, but the performers and the audience are not in the same space, so physical space. So we can say it's not theater, maybe, but we can also argue that it's the same digital space. But what we do, for example, with actual theater with theater or actually theater performances that don't have human beings. For example, there is the performance Uncanny Valley by Rimini Protocol, where the only performer on stage is a robot, and I'm calling him. It has a monologue. So is that theater, or do we call it an installation? I also saw a recording of one performance from New York. I forgot the name, but the only two performers are bots who are having an intellectual discussion, and there are no human beings. So what do we do with these things? Do we call them theater? Do we call them installations? I think that all of these things are just questions for us, and how to approach the question of theater in the digital age and how to revise it.
Yes, I mean, just to address that a bit, I think it depends on the purpose, the motives of creation, and whether it's an installation or theatre. Personally, I'm just not interested in that question. I'm just interested in the event and the purpose of it, and is it trying to change brain cells and perceptions in any way whatsoever? If it is, it's worth exploring. That would be my short question. Yes.
I'm sorry, do we have time for another question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, please.
My name is Bora. I'm a participant at the Theatre Criticism Workshop. I'm very lucky to be here and thrilled. I would like to circle back to the topic of this panel discussion, if I may, whether critics save the theatre or theatre saves the critics. I like what Natasha mentioned, the example about how you can create more solid, decent theatre criticism by creating opportunities and nurturing that. My question has to do with the validation. I don't know if theatre critics seek any kind of validation, but if there is an authority who would evaluate the work of the critic and the impact of his, her, or their work, who would that authority be? I'm using authority for lack of a better word. Should there be such an authority at all? And if yes, who would that be?
Would be God.
I take my question back. Thank you.
I don't know if Franco is here from Italy, because in Italy at least there's order of the journalist where you have to be a member. It's not a critical guild, not a critics guild, but it's an institution where you have to pass to become a journalist. And maybe if Franco is here, maybe he can explain how that works, and if that is helpful.
No, in Italy we have still this rule, no, to practice journalism, no, because to ever be a member of the board of a journalism, and so you have to have an examination to become a journalist, as well the critics, no? If you want to work in the normal newspaper, you need to be member of the, and so if you pass the examination, you need to demonstrate that you already worked in the newspaper, and the society paid you the social, how do you say, the social security for your writing in newspaper. So, but so now most of the new generation of journalists, they don't want to take part in this order, and they write anyway.
Yes, good for them. There's a variant there's a peer-based system. Taking your question more seriously than I did before, and I apologize for being so glib, but there are critics circles in New York. They're local. They're like the Los Angeles Drama Critics Circle, the New York Drama Critics Circle, and they admit people by repute, by the quality of the work they've done, and it's not a rigorous formal exam or anything like that. And then nationally, there's the American Critics Association, which works in a similar way. So I guess that's the closest we have to validation in answer to your question.
Thank you.
Sorry, hi. I'm Lara Permiani from the UK via Italy, or vice versa, I don't know. Anyway, my observation was, and it's going back to bloggers, because I think validation, when it comes to critics and working for a newspaper is one thing, but now, at least in the UK, you know, as like an emerging artist, if you want to say so about myself, 10 years ago, you would do a show, and if you were lucky, you would get 3 reviewers in, as a kind of non-commercial, off-West End / fringe performer. Now you do a show, and you get a call from your PR and says, oh, you have 35 reviewers in, and like 34 of them are bloggers you've never heard about. And the result, I think, is this kind of, even reviews and even your show gets lost into this crowd of people that are completely self-appointed critics, and some of them, let's face it, write in a very pedestrian way as well. And it does, I don't know which kind of, because I completely agree with Natasha about the importance of of reviews for artists, because if you get a good review in the Stage or, you know, in the Evening Standard, like, obviously you can then go to a venue and say, hey, do you want to program my show? If you get a 5-star review in Ollie and Benji's Hot Picks, it doesn't have any kind of weight in a way, but at the same time, it crowds the space a lot. So I always wonder sometimes if there could be some sort of way to filter bloggers, you know, so that you get that there is a way to be, I don't know, a starred blogger or somebody whose opinion has a different kind of weight. Because otherwise I feel like, even when I want to go and see a show and I look it up, there are all these entries by bloggers that don't mean much to me, and then in the end I'm just gonna go and see what The Guardian writes about it, because it's like, okay, at least I know, or what Natasha writes about it, you know what I mean? It just feels like there is this overcrowding that I don't know how to navigate personally, both as an audience and as an artist.
I can address that in one way, and it parallels what Natasha told me earlier, is that in the UK there was this period, and those amount of bloggers have dissipated, and I can say the same thing is true in Los Angeles. I do want to say that among those bloggers, and then there were plenty of them, there were some really important, really highly curious and some quality writing coming out of that. And that's one of the benefits of the kind of populism in the field. They earned their own reputation and they created their own platform. Now that whole ecosystem has shrunk because of the lack of support for it. Nonetheless, I just think the poorer quality bloggers have disappeared as a direct consequence of their own irrelevance. Whereas the more quality bloggers have remained as a consequence of their passion. And I think that's probably a healthy thing.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with what Stephen just said. I think there is a kind of a process happens sort of organically, almost, like that there is within going back a few years, there were some incredibly articulate and exciting voices writing about theatre, and I still think, well, that the model has. Well, circumstances have shifted to a degree. There are still some very impassioned, very committed writers whose knowledge kind of comes through in their writing, and most people, when they're engaging with online, as savvy, you know, we have understanding of quality. They'll be drawn to the voices that speak to them, and the ones that doesn't happen will, I guess, be filtered out organically, and then other voices will have, you know, positions of trust for certain readerships if they speak about queer theatre in a very sort of granular, informed way. If they speak about fringe musicals in a really like knowledgeable way, that there'll probably be audiences for a lot of those bloggers, and if they're not, they will probably sort of disappear anyway. I think when you're online, you can quickly engage with someone who's voice, for whatever reason, whether it's their quality of the writing, it's the knowledge base they bring, or some other aspect of their work that speaks to you, then that has value to you, and that will be very different for a different person engaging with those voices. So I understand exactly what you're saying, and there can be sometimes feel like a little overwhelmingness of voices if you're an artist, like going through these different responses to your work. But I think we all make our sort of judgments as readers and bring that to bear when we're engaging with voices online. And the quality writers will, I think, always sort of become apparent and will filter through and will have some impact.
I don't know if always the quality writers survive, but I mean a bit that organic system, or that organic procedure, of course, occurs, and also I, as a reader, how I collect information, or how I sort out information, work in this way. I build trust to certain sources, and I build distrust to other sources, and that's it. And of course you can think about new institution, a kind of peer review. It's maybe an idea, maybe a good idea, but yeah, it works only with people who then longer remain in it, and also with people who want to work like peers to review, who want to put time and money and brain into it, and that's maybe the point why it won't happen.
I actually have a question for anyone who has an answer, if there is an answer. Do you know someone who was a blogger and then was integrated into the critics community, that some media asked them to participate?
Thank you. I'm Oana from Romania. And yes, I know some bloggers which were integrated, and their reviews were integrated in theater's comments about the reflection of their production. And maybe we are forced to face this new era of moving from newspapers and printed magazine to online, and there maybe it is a more democratic system, but also just people who have something to say and know how to say and to judge what they say resist. And this is maybe some system which is fitted to the young generation system of how to take their information. So it is a new era for critics. And I want to comment a little another problem we face in Romania these years, and which is very important to us, because the question is how the critic is involved in an ethic judgment, which regards the process of producing performances. We talk about abuse or about this system of stage director, which is a little the only one who impose their methods. And we had some abusive methods of working with actors, especially in state theaters, not only in the independent medium. And the question is how critics could could favorize a healthy system of working.
We had a scandal out of Chicago of a theater director who engaged in abuse of actors in the name of realism. And actually, there were violent scenes in which actors were beaten up, physically assaulted, and this went on for years, and a weekly newspaper called the Chicago Reader blew it open. So it was a journalist who exposed this, and it became a national story, and the theater had to close as a result of it.
We had a similar story with an invited director who slammed an actress during the premiere in the entr'acte. Yeah. And someone from technical staff of the theater called the police. Mm-hmm. And the management of theater didn't want to give voice to this situation. But critics, a part of critics, comment, and this follow by banishing, in a sort, all the performances made by this director in theaters from Romania, yes. And refuse him, despite the quality of the performance. We refuse the selection in festivals, because we think it is a sign that theater must give a healthy and an ethical milieu of work.
It sounds like in Romania, at least, and in Chicago, that was being handled. I'm curious in the UK and in Germany if you had similar situations.
I mean, it's a big problem, and it's addressed recently more frequently. But when we look to certain cases, I mean, I was also, no, I refused to report about one case because there was a problem that the evidence was not clear. And we have sometimes cases where it's from the outside hard to see what really happened, what is instrumentalized, because in that certain house there were several fractions who had a big infight with each other, and it was a ballet school, the most famous ballet school in Berlin, and every side was using some of the pupils with that what they saw, what they perceived, what they suffered. But we as journalists, we had not direct access to the pupils, and I mean they are minors, and that's also okay that they are saved and that they are not exposed into public. Also, we could report anonymously about them, but still they would be exposed to us, and therefore the authorities and municipalities said, no, you can't talk with them. You can look at some of the documents, but not all of the documents, and I, from that partly evidence I had, could not profoundly decide what was going on, what was instrumentalization, who was to blame, and also when I would have discussed it, I would have exposed minors. So that was in that case my problem, and why I didn't write about it. And I mean, the good thing is there was investigation going on, there were a lot of commissions going on, there were psychologists involved, there were a lot of meetings between the people from the school and between the parents, and also the pupils created their own ecosystem. So there were some good developments out of it, but reporting on that is sometimes very tricky.
I think we've run over time. I think we were supposed to be 90 minutes, and I think we're at that point. So with that, I would like to thank Natasha, Tom, and Borisav for your wisdom and experience, and thank you again to Chandra Multimedia for hosting this and putting on the festival. And we can, as they say, where I come from, we can take this outside. So thank you again.